Welcome back to another episode of The State of Sustainability. I'm your host, Saif Hameed, founder and CEO of Altruistic. Excited to jump in to the new corporate net zero standard of the Science Based Targets Initiative. This is version 2 of the SPTi standard. Longtime listeners will know that I have a love-hate relationship with regulation and quasi-regulation, which is odd for someone in my sector and space. But every now and then I kind of pull my own tooth out and dive in and do an episode on something that smells like regulation. And so this is one of those. I am not going to talk through everything that is in the 130-page document. Instead, I am going to give a little bit about the background of where I think this is coming from and what I think is going on with SBTi that is context for this. I'm going to talk a bit about what I see as the major shifts in the new standard. And then I'm going to talk about what I think that these shifts mean in terms of the journey ahead and kind of what I think has been resolved or achieved, what I think is not yet resolved or not yet achieved. And so that's sort of how I'm going to cover this. If you want to learn more, there's plenty of material out there on the new standard, including the standard itself, which I always recommend people read. Unfortunately, I think not many people will read it. I think everyone will get AI to summarize it. And so we're creating this industry where people get AI to write 130-page documents and people get AI to read 130-page documents. It's this weird world we're living in. Anyway, let's get into things. So, a lot of stuff has been going on with SBTi. Everyone who has followed SBTi through the ages, fun fact, back in like 2018 or 2019, I think I was like the only person at McKinsey, which was like 20,000 consultants, who knew what an SBTi target looked like, or what SBTi was. So all these things sort of came through to me. It's really exciting to see how SBTi has grown. And so actually, like, that's the first bit of context, I think, which is SPTi has grown super fast. Despite all of its chaos, and we'll get into that in a moment, SPTi has just like grown by, high double-digit percentages year on year for the last few years. I think they've just crossed 10,000 verified companies as part of SPTi. What is interesting within this is that actually a lot of the highest growth has come from Asia. Japan, China, even Southeast Asia have been some of the largest contributors to that growth. And if you start unpacking that and you wonder what's behind that growth, I think we're seeing two really interesting drivers of that growth that I think are exciting for the times to come. One is that a lot of the sort of traditional manufacturing hubs and supply chains of companies like Unilever and others are now sort of coming on board on the train and are trying to make sure that they are sort of climate compliant. And whether it's that they're sort of selling to one of these companies that is based in based in Europe, let's say, and a big sustainability advocate like a Unilever, or whether they're looking to even maybe just export into Europe and they're thinking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or they're thinking about increasing sustainability requirements for their customers, I think that value chain shift has now really started to hit Asia in a big way. And those of us who were working in Asia over the last several years will have seen early signals. Like I remember 3-4 years ago at Altruistic, we started working with the largest packaging company in Pakistan. And that was odd. It's not a huge business. It's maybe $500 million revenue or thereabouts. But actually, like, their customers were Unilever and I guess probably Nestle as well, and all the big FMCGs. And so you sort of see where that came from. Similarly, a lot of the textile players across South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and also like in Southeast Asia and Vietnam and so on, were all actually moving pretty fast on Scope 1 and 2. Very significant reductions in Scope 1 and 2 emissions, also starting to think about Scope 3 emissions. And so that shift that was already material a few years ago, where the main linchpins of the manufacturing hubs were already starting to think about targets and verify and manage emissions, we've just seen more of that happen. And so Asia is really coming on board the train in a big way. And this SPTi growth wave, I think, is testament to that. And that plays in, I think, into this V2 standard as well. And I'll come to why I think this emerging markets shift has meant that emerging markets are more in the mindset of SPTi than they might have been 5 years ago. Another thing in the context for SPTi is that they've had, I would say, a bit of a crisis of confidence and identity. And I think this has been caused by some, as you say in tennis, unforced errors, where they sort of missed a shot that they had no reason to miss. And I think things like, for instance, is it last year or the year before where they had that announcement and then they retracted it. And then there was talk about like the Bezos Earth Fund putting pressure on them for this, that. You all know the details as well as I do. And I think we've probably done a podcast episode on it. But they had a lot of these sort of gaffes and public missteps that I think damaged people's confidence in them. And for the last couple of years, within the sustainability community, I do think there was a little bit of a sort of not quite inside joke, but a bit of a inside snarkiness or inside cattiness about SBTi and when they'll get their act together and when they'll close these loopholes and will they even be around in several years. And I think that's not just about how the external community perceived SBTi, but I imagine it's also about how the SBTi team perceived SBTi. And one of the big elements of this sort of statement that they released around offsets and then retracted was that the team also felt that the SBTi leadership had come under pressure and had shifted position quite radically at the level of the trustees and the board, but not at the level of the management and the company. And so there's quite a big internal backlash. And I think all of that just means that SBTi has, I would expect, been thinking about what is SBTi? What is the role that we play in the world? What do we want to be going forward? Remember when SBTi first came about, it was almost like just a culty thing, right? Like, I mean, when I kind of said I was the only person in McKinsey who seemed to know what it was, I'm probably exaggerating. There might have been one or two others. It's just because it was a bit of a culty thing. I was part of the cult. And, so were all the people trying to set SBTi targets. We were all part of this little cult of environmental nut jobs. And now, of course, that's grown and become mainstream. And so SBTi now needs to think, well, what does it mean to be mainstream in this world? And what does it mean to be on this ongoing journey where it's not just about a kind of once and done target setting job where you set a net zero target, SBTi stamps it, and they sort of come back in every year or so to see how you're doing on that journey. Like, what does an ongoing support mechanism and infrastructure look like? And then finally, sorry, I'm still on context. I thought it'd be past context by now. The third piece I would say is that SBTi just had all these open questions, also because they had this weird relationship of codependency with their estranged cousin, the greenhouse gas protocol, where you kind of need the greenhouse gas protocol and SBTi to both sort of work in lockstep because one is defining the accounting framework and one is defining the target framework. And targets without understanding what the accounting framework looks like kind of don't make sense. And accounting frameworks without having an idea where you're going with this also doesn't make sense. So they're both sort of codependent, but they both work on different timescales as well, which means that you often know what one of them believes when it comes to things like, let's say, offsets or insets or scope 3 or flag or forestry, land and agriculture, for instance, but you don't always know it at the same time for both. Anyway, so these, I would say, are the three bits of backdrop that I think are interesting. One is the radical growth, particularly coming out of Asia. The second is this sort of crisis of confidence and identity within SBTi and about SBTi. And the third, I think, is just the sort of various open questions, particularly around things like offsets and insets and EACs, attribution certificates, and the like, which SBTi has sort of been plagued by for a while. So the new standard, I think, does a few things. Let's say it tries to do a few things, and I think it does do a few things. I'm sounding like a video game review for anyone who reads video game reviews still. What SBTi tries to do, I think, is they try and set out really a mission statement and a purpose statement. That's actually how I read the document, particularly like, when I kind of read the sort of the visioning elements of the document. I think this is SBTi's leadership trying to say, this is what we think SBTi is going to be in the world. And I think what they're saying is SPTi is going to be a broad church for as many companies as we can bring into this church as possible. SPTi is going to be there for the long-term journey of all these companies that we bring into this broad church. And SPTi is going to be there in an ongoing way in the details as infrastructure to just help you on that road also. I think that's kind of what they're going for. There's obviously much that is the same. There are a few big things that I think are different in this new version. The first is categorization. And this actually it's kind of an odd one, but it's quite important because it sort of runs through all of the standard, which is SPTi introduces this idea of category A and category B. And the shorthand of it is category A is big companies and companies in high-income countries. Like that's sort of how they see category A. Category A is the wealthy in this sort of split. Those who should bear, to quote from Keir Starmer, former Prime Minister as of recording this episode of the UK, those with the widest shoulders should bear the greatest burden. I think that's the line. And so SBTi basically says category A is companies with over 1,000 FTE or full-time employees and revenue of over 450 million. There are also some sort of balance sheet elements and some emissions thresholds that count towards being considered a big company. Or if you're in a country that meets the high income threshold that SPTi sets. So basically they're saying high income country or big company, this puts you into category A. And you're in category B if you're the sort of the converse of this, which is you're a small company or you're in a low-income country as well. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to make this work for also all the Asian constituents that they would want to have, all the Global South constituents that they would want to have, many companies of which will be in low-income countries. And they're also, I think, trying to continue to expand their base in the high-income countries by saying, well, you don't just have to be a Unilever or a Procter & Gamble. You can be an SME or a mid-sized business as well, and we still have a place for you on this journey. So this categorization is one element of shift. I think it's very significant, not just because it runs all the way through the document, but also because it, I think, genuinely tries to expand the addressable market for SPTi, and I think it tries to do that quite radically. The second big shift is that SBTi is actively trying to create various degrees of optionality. So, for instance, you don't need to commit to a net zero target. There are a range of different targets or target types that you could commit to. In fact, it's a very wide range, right? So at the sort of highest level, you could be committing to an overarching Scope 3 absolute emissions reduction target. You could be committing to an overarching supplier or customer alignment target where you're actually anchoring yourself on someone else's target, or you could be committing to a category or activity specific target. So for instance, something in your downstream emissions, you're committing to make that reduction, or, for that matter, in your upstream emissions. So it tries to actually create a pretty wide spectrum of targets that ideally could work for you, depending on where you are in your place on this journey. The level of commitment that you have to offsets is also different, also optional. Like it tries to, I'll come to this in the role for finance, but SBTi tries to take a very active position on offsets in this standard in a way that I don't think it's actually done formally before. And it basically says, well, if you are a category A company, then as of 2035, you're going to have to commit to offsetting 1% of your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. But if you're not a category A company, then there's actually quite a wide range of optionality in terms of what you could commit to. And even if you are a category A company and you want to make a commitment earlier on, then there's a wide range of commitments that you could be making. So it tries to give quite a lot of optionality. And the third element of optionality is just how you will use insets, let's say, or value chain reductions. And so there's a prioritization framework, which is you should first try and target the actual activity or the activity pool. And then you can sort of go progressively wider and engage in initiatives that might be targeting, let's say, a supply shed or a broader commodity category, ideally as close as possible to what you're actually buying from or what you're actually working on or working with. But in general, there's quite a lot of sort of optionality in this. And I would say that speaks to the pragmatism that SPTi is trying to bring into the new version. The third thing that I think is a pretty big shift is the role, I'm going to call it like the role for finance. But really, it's the position that SPTi takes on who owns and is responsible for the emissions, I would say. And my view is that SPTi is kind of taking this position where it says, if you are in this SPTi community or cult, which we have tried to create as wide as possible, as big a church as possible, then we want you to own the offsetting of your residual emissions. And for the wealthy amongst you, by which it means the large companies and those in high-income countries, we expect that ownership to ultimately be complete. In that, it starts at 1%, but it ramps up to 100% by your net zero target year, for instance, if you've got a net zero target. So actually, almost like morally or ethically, SBTi is taking this position where they're saying the right answer for those who can is to own the responsibility for all of their emissions that are left and pay for that, to pay for those emissions to be mitigated or stored or removed. The other thing that, and I think that SBTi is trying to reinforce this in a few different ways. One is they also are opinionated on what counts as a good offset. And so there's a very clear bias, I would say, towards technical offsets or offsets that result in permanent removal or permanent removal for permanent emissions, for instance. And in that sense, nature-based solutions and all that stuff is seen as a stepping stone or a kind of lesser, more time-bound avenue. But really, there's a fairly strong opinion here on what counts as an enduring offset, which I think is I was going to say which I think is right, but I think it's actually debatable. Some would certainly argue with me, and I don't want to get into that argument just yet. I think that the other way in which SBTi tries to reinforce this is through this ongoing emissions responsibility concept. And this ongoing emissions responsibility functions a little bit as a club with incentives. And it's sort of like a voluntary club, basically. So you as a company, once you've set your targets, you can decide whether you want to join this club, this ongoing emissions responsibility program. If you decide you don't want to join this, you have to provide some justification of why you're not going to join it. And if you're category A, you still have to commit to this 1% of ongoing emissions reduction offsetting from 2035 onwards. And you have to kind of raise it to 100%, like I said, by your net zero year. This podcast is brought to you by Altruistic. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistic's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistic.com to find out more. That's altruistic with a Q. Otherwise, if you do decide that you want to take part in it, then you basically can opt to join one of a few different levels of commitment. You can say you're engaged, you can say you're advanced, you can say you're part of the leadership group, and SBTi will offer you public recognition for your progress within this sort of track that you pick. And the differentiating element of this is how big or how meaningful is your sort of contribution budget towards basically offsetting your emissions. And I think this is a fairly explicit direction that SBTi is stating, which is it used to be a gray area for SBTi, and it's very clearly now an incentivized area that SBTi wants to promote. So what do I think all of this means in terms of these big shifts? I think one is that signing up to SPTi is a lot easier now. I think that's definitely true. In my video game review, I would say pretty much full marks for this, to be honest. I don't see how SPTi could have gone further without meaningfully watering down what it means to join SPTi. I think that they've clearly tried to draw the line. They've tried to accommodate big companies and small companies. They've tried to accommodate emerging markets. They've tried to accommodate companies that have hard to abate emissions and can't really drive emissions reductions across their value chain in the way that maybe some others could, and therefore they're expected to offset. You could argue, well, they've kind of raised the average offset cost implicitly because technical offsets and permanent removals tend to be more expensive than cheaper nature-based solutions and cook stoves and the like. But in general, I would say they've gone pretty much as far as I think you could to make signing up to SBTi easier, including this element about not having to do an absolute emissions reduction target and having lots of optionality in what the targets look like. I think that's one big outcome or difference that we're going to see. And I think that's going to drive increased adoption of SBTi in the years to come. I think that they're going to end up catalyzing the flow of money into the whole climate finance space, I think. And I'm intrigued to see how that plays out. The whole offset territory has had a pretty bad run the last few years. I stopped tracking how big the market was a couple of years ago, but from what I recall, it kind of was more or less flat for quite a while. And all the companies that sort of were in that space, I think of like the South Poles and the others, from what I can tell, have struggled with their offset businesses. And, maybe they would admit it, maybe they wouldn't, but I don't think it's sort of really grown at the rate that they would have expected. And I think this is also true for a lot of the newer players that came in to work at the intersection of developing projects or trading offsets or verifying offsets and so on. That whole space didn't do as well as expected. But I think this could be a meaningful boost, and let's see how it plays out. I think that the developments that we're seeing in Asia will further catalyze this, because actually what's interesting is if you kind of think about, a lot of the interesting markets to go and do these sorts of removals could also be emerging markets potentially, and that's an untapped area of potential growth and development. And stock exchanges across multiple emerging markets in APAC, for instance, are now requiring climate strategies as part of their sort of standard requirements. And I think that's going to also, together with this SPTi piece, potentially start moving more money back into climate action. The third thing that I think that this new standard is going to catalyze is more credentialing. And you can call this greenwashing, or you can call it like just sustainability branding. It's probably not greenwashing. I think sustainability branding is better in this context. But what I mean is SBTi is giving the average company more to say and more to talk about. And they're doing that because there are now more ways that you can commit to a target. So more companies will start talking about the targets that they've set. And they're also giving you more things that you could do with them that will merit recognition, like this sort of, this group for ongoing emissions responsibility. And so there'll be more to shout about. So I expect to see more companies shouting about more stuff as a result of this. There'll probably be a lag of a couple of years, but eventually I expect to see more out there. What I think isn't fully detailed out, I think there's sort of two problems or two things that I don't think are really resolved. One is insets was sort of not resolved till now and kind of is still a little open, because while it is clear how SBTi views insets and what role they play, it is not really clear how they are defined. A lot of these sort of words like system, for instance, are not really defined with clear boundaries where it's apparent what counts as an inset under this framework and what doesn't. And I think SPTi is just assuming that that will get picked up by the greenhouse gas protocol, which it probably should be. But then you get back to this point about how the two institutions don't really move in direct lockstep, which creates a lag and just an annoyance for companies, I think. The second thing that I think is created by this standard is that you can have two companies in the same sector with very different pathways. And there are many ways that you could have two companies in the same sector with very different pathways, both of which could be SPTi aligned, but that just means something completely different. And so let's say you have like a textile company, for instance, in Germany and a textile company in Bangladesh. You could have two textile companies in Germany, but just different size and scale. You could have two textile SMEs, let's say, in Bangladesh, and they've just committed to completely different targets because one has chosen something, one has chosen another. And so I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, but the number of permutations that you could have for companies which to the outside world look reasonably similar, there's quite a wide range there. I don't think that's a problem, but I think it's just going to be interesting, and it is something to look at. So for instance, for those who have an interest in other companies signing up to an SBTi target. So if you are trying to get your suppliers to sign up to this, or your customers or distributors to sign up to this, then I think it is likely no longer sufficient for you just to know that they have done it. Yes, there's a tick. I think you're probably going to want to know what exactly have they signed up for? What does that pathway look like? What are they really doing? Because that could look very different for two companies that might look to you quite similar in your supply chain. Anyway, so that is my little deep dive on the new standard. What did we cover? We covered a bit about the backdrop. So where did this come from? This came from high levels of growth for SPTi over the last several years, in particular emerging markets, Asia, driving a lot of that growth. And I think a need to accommodate those sorts of companies and more of those companies. I think the backdrop also included this sort of crisis of confidence and identity and the open questions that SPTi has been plagued with for a few years. The new standard, I think, aims to codify a few big shifts into normal corporate practice. One is this idea of categorization and the sort of broad shoulders versus narrow shoulders, I guess, or the rich versus poor, or however you want to put it. Then there's this sort of move towards optionality and pragmatism by giving you many different ways in which you can participate in SPTi. And then the other shift is this very clear role, I would say, for climate finance, and a clear position and a clear ideology, really, that SPTi is expressing behind that. Where I think this leads is I think it makes signing up easier. You'll have more companies joining SPTi and growth continuing, I think, apace. You'll have more money going into climate finance, I think, and climate action. And it's going to be interesting to see how that just plays around with things. And I do think you'll have more credentialing and more stuff going out there as companies talk about what they're doing. What is in detail, like I said, is what really counts towards insets, and also this element of just companies that look very similar actually doing very different things. Always excited to hear from anyone who has thoughts about the show, either this episode or even ideas for future episodes. My email is in the show notes. If you want to support the show, please leave us a review, share the episode, hit follow to make sure that you never miss an episode. And I look forward to having you with us next time.